It's good to be with you all here. Thank you all for coming tonight. I work with a group called the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and it's our 20th anniversary this year. I'm currently doing a 30-day, what do you call it, endurance test of the West Coast. I started in San Diego a week ago or so, and I'm heading all the way to Bellingham, Washington, speaking along the way. So 24 cities in 30 days, and very glad to be here with you all. Let me start with a bit about my own background. I think it's always interesting to hear something about your speaker a little more, so that you know more about them. I grew up in a military family and moved around the United States and around Europe growing up. And in 1968, my family was living in the panhandle of Florida, Fort Walton Beach, Florida. It's so conservative there, they call it Lower Alabama. And I had my first organizing experience that year in 1968. I was the vice chair of the Okaloosa, Florida Young Republican Club, working on the Nixon campaign. And I did such a good job working on that campaign that when they had this big fish fry fundraiser right before the election, they invited me to sit at the head table with their speaker of honor that evening, a guy that probably some of you have heard of. He died a couple of years ago, former Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. Like, why this reaction? I don't understand. And then it kind of went downhill after that. We moved actually from there in late '69 to California, to Beale Air Force Base, where I then went to Wheatland High School. After I graduated from high school, I wanted to be like my dad. I wanted to be a lifer. And so I tried to join the Air Force and went to the Oakland Induction Center. And they had us arrive early, I remember, about an hour early it seemed, and we were all standing outside. I was probably the only volunteer. Everyone else was drafted there in January of 1971. And I will never forget, as we're standing in line, these two people were working the line. One of them was a black man who basically had no face. He had no nose, he had no ears. He just had a few holes in his face, and his face was completely burnt and scarred. And he had been in Vietnam and been injured, obviously, and was trying to convince us not to go in the military. And then there was a woman, a mother, whose son had been killed there, and she was also working the line. And I'll never forget to this day the deep emotion with which she was pleading with us, wailing in her pain, as she asked us not to join the military and make our mother suffer the way she had as well. But as it turned out, I flunked my induction physical because of an old high school football injury. And so when most people were trying, of good sense I'll say, were trying to stay out of the military, or trying to get waivers to stay out, I had to get a waiver to get in. And I was put on a bus with all the other people that were requesting waivers for different reasons, and sent to San Francisco to the Army Presidio Hospital, where we had to go through further testing. And I'm sitting next to a guy on the bus who was claiming he had flat feet. And he was the nicest guy in the world. You know, I was kind of a little bit shy and embarrassed that he would judge me and think I was a bit foolish for wanting to join the military at this time. But you know, first impressions are really quite important. And I will say that he, to me, represented kind of the peace movement, if you will. I didn't know much about the peace movement. I lived behind these barbed wire fences all my life. Young patriot that I was, Boy Scout. But he really, really touched me with his loving concern and openness. As it turned out, he did not get his waiver. I got mine. I joined the Air Force. And so after my training, I was sent to another base in California called Travis Air Force Base, that probably most of you have heard of, not far from here. That is an airlift base, and at that time was daily ferrying troops to Vietnam, and when the planes would come back, they would bring the body bags of the dead soldiers. And just across the street from where I worked, almost every day on the flight line, you would see the rows and rows of body bags. And on the weekends, outside the base, there would be 8 or 9 or 10 people out there holding signs. And I could just hear them talking to each other now. Do you think this does any good? Do you think anyone's listening to us? Do you think we'll ever stop this war? And little did they know that we would talk about them endlessly in the chow hall, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, in the barracks at night, and on the job. And that's why I'm a firm believer today in protests at military installations and weapons corporations. Because I believe that, in fact, while we can't quantify it and qualify it here in numerical terms and empirical evidence, that in fact lives do get changed from these protests, and I believe I'm evidence of it as well. But as I checked into the barracks there at Travis on my very first day, they looked down this clipboard at this roster, and this man says to me, "Oh my God, I'm really sorry. We've only got one room left. Get your bags," he said, "follow me." And we walked down this long, dark hallway, and he kept saying, "Really, we'll get you out of here as soon as we can." And I thought it would be a broom closet with a cot, and I'd spent a couple nights in there. And when he opened the door, we walked in, there were anti-war posters all over the wall. As it turned out, this was one of the leading GI resistance movement organizers in the barracks. They were keeping him isolated because they didn't have enough stuff on him yet. They were trying to kick him out. But they soon forgot about me, and I remained in that room. And at night there would be a knock on the door, and white guys would come in with chairs and sit in the circle and talk about the war. I'm sitting in the corner thinking, these must be communists. Another night there was a knock on the door, and black guys would come in with chairs and sit in a circle. They were Black Panthers from the cities, talking about racism in America and in the military. And I'm sitting in the corner thinking, these definitely have to be communists. And then they started smoking marijuana. Now, I had heard of marijuana before, and I want to promise you all that I never, ever inhaled. I swear to God, I never did. But over the years, I've learned much about secondhand smoke, the effect of secondhand smoke on innocent people. And so I believe that breathing in that marijuana over a period of time had some effect on my brain. And I began to move my chair into the circle. I began to read their publications. I began to participate in the discussions. And soon enough, I decided that I was an anti-war resistor too. I decided I was also a conscientious objector, and I went and asked if I could be released. And the first question to me was, well, what's your family history? Do you come from a traditional peace church, the Quakers, the Mennonite, the Church of the Brethren? I said, no, I grew up in a military family. I was a young Republican for Nixon. And so they turned me down. And I didn't know enough at the time that there were other options available to me. So I did 3.5 years what I called hard time. Because after I figured out what was really going on, it was extremely hard for me to be in the United States military. But after I got out, I went to Florida, and I was going to college at the University of Florida, just ready to graduate, studying political science and sociology, when I got recruited by the United Farm Workers Union to become an organizer of fruit pickers in Florida. I was sent to California for training at La Paz, the UFW headquarters, and then back to Florida where I worked for the union for several years, and from there moved into social justice organizing, and in the early 80s began working in the peace movement in Orlando, Florida. And in those days there was a word that was floating around, particularly the environmental community. The word was bioregion. And the idea was look into your bioregion where you live and get involved with the issues in your region. And so we began looking at what was happening with the military in Florida. And of course, the Space Center was just so near to us. And we began learning and organizing protests at the Space Center to try to prevent the militarization, the weaponization, and the nuclearization of space. And in those early 80s, I must say that one of the local folks from around here, Gwen Kirk, paid a visit to our community and gave us a hand and gave us a lift in our effort to educate people about the dangers of all the things that were going on. And a great activist she turned out to be, Gwen Kirk.
Yes.
Give her a hand. But tonight I want to talk to you largely about the military-industrial complex as a criminal corporate syndicate. And in order to do that, I have to tell one more story from my youth. I wanted to be an FBI agent when I was a kid. I wanted to fight organized crime. I mean, I bought the whole package. Let me just put that on the table, okay? And because I was a Boy Scout and we had the motto, be prepared, I thought I'd get a head start on everybody else. And so I sent away for an FBI correspondence course. And I learned that such things as fingerprints, everybody has their own, distinct fingerprint. But they sent me a book of definitions. And one of them I still remember. M.O. Modus operandi. Every criminal has an M.O. Well, let's talk about the corporate military syndicate's M.O. You remember the Civil War, at which time the weapons corporations in America made a lot of profit. And as the Civil War came to an end, they were a little bit worried. Where were they going to continue to make so much money? The Indian Wars were beginning to wind down. Out in the Dakotas, the people, the Lakota and the Sioux Indians were being brought onto the reservation in increasing numbers. And by 1877, there were just two bands left. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And out in Texas, the Comanches were around that same time being brought onto the reservation by the U.S. military. And the deal was with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who finally agreed to come onto the reservation, largely because their people were starving to death. As gold was discovered in the Black Hills, what the native people called the Paha Sapa, the heart of the world, the whites, as they moved into the Black Hills, were destroying all the game, and the people were starving. The Army, as the railroad moved west, invented new high-powered weapons, rifles, that they were using to shoot the buffalo as the trains would roll through the plains, and leaving the buffalo to die right there on the plains themselves. And so the people that used to saw the buffalo as their sacred brother, who fed them and kept them warm in the winter, were literally dying. So against their better judgment, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull came onto the reservation. And the deal was that they had to give up their gun and their horses, essentially their way of life. And they were promised by the U.S. government that they would be taken care of as long as the grass grew green. But the weapons corporations that were in charge of providing them with provisions and various things discovered that they could kind of skimp on stuff and collect more profit. So the blankets that were delivered to the people were so thin that they were freezing in the middle of the winter. The bacon was rancid. The flour had bugs in it. And so the people were even starving on the reservation. But still, that wasn't enough profit for the military-industrial complex. They wanted more. And so they put together a team of artists and writers, and they did renderings of Crazy Horse back on the warpath, killing settlers as they moved west, raping white women, killing children, and they wrote stories, fabricated stories, and they placed these in all the major newspapers around the country. And of course, the American people were outraged and demanded that Congress bring these savages back onto the reservation. And of course, Congress swung into action immediately and reappropriated more money for the Indian Wars, even though Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were sitting inside their teepee on the reservation with not a horse or a gun to their name. Well, when I was in the Air Force, I read the Pentagon Papers, released to the New York Times by one of my great heroes, Daniel Ellsberg, that told the internal government's own story about how they fabricated the pretext for the war in Vietnam. And more recently, in 2003, the lies about weapons of mass destruction that led to shock and awe in Iraq. And now today, in our own time, in this very moment, the stories that Iran is going to attack someone, Israel or the United States, with nuclear weapons, when in fact they have no nuclear weapons, nor do they have a long-range missile that can even reach the United States of America. I live in Bath, Maine, where Navy Aegis warships are built, destroyers. They're built by General Dynamics Corporation at Bath Iron Works. And they're being outfitted with so-called missile defense systems. And they're being used today to surround Russia and China. When Bush was president, he had one version of missile defense that he was planning to deploy in Poland and the Czech Republic. But after Obama was elected, he said, we're not going to deploy Bush's missile defense system. And some people cheered. And some people called me and said, Bruce, why aren't you cheering? Obama said he's not going to deploy these systems. And I said to them, watch the magician's other hand. And it was only a few months later that Obama revealed his plan, that he was going to deploy a different kind of missile defense system, one that was based largely on these Aegis destroyers, these Navy warships. And so today, ground-based launchers are being put into Poland and Romania by the Obama administration. Missile defense radars are going into Turkey. They're negotiating with Georgia on Russia's southern border to put them there as well. And Obama is sending these Aegis warships with these missile defense systems on board into the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Mediterranean Seas, beginning an encirclement of Russia. NATO is also expanding eastward. You might remember that when the Soviet Union collapsed, former Secretary of State Jim Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 centimeter into the Warsaw Pact, into the former Soviet Union. But when Clinton became president, he began violating that promise by pushing NATO eastward, and now today NATO is on steroids, as well as these U.S. deployments beginning to surround Russia. Russia, of course, is freaking out, as we would if Russia or China was building bases in Mexico and Canada and putting their warships off either of our two coasts. And Russia is now also saying that the recent very modest nuclear reductions that were negotiated in the New START treaty between Obama and the Russians. Remember, Obama said he wanted to reset relations with Russia. Russia is now saying that that treaty is in jeopardy if the U.S. continues with these missile defense deployments. But why is the United States trying to restart the Cold War with Russia? What's the reason? Could it be because Russia has the world's largest supply of natural gas and significant supplies of oil? Don't we know by now that the military's role in the world today is essentially a resource extraction service? Does anyone doubt at all that this is really what's going on? At the same time, China is now being surrounded with missile defense systems. Ground-based launchers are going into Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and just 2 weeks ago it was announced they're going into Okinawa. These Navy warships with missile defense on board are being deployed in Japan, South Korea, Australia, Guam, and we're negotiating now. The Obama administration is negotiating with Vietnam, Singapore, and other countries in the region. And on top of that, that's not enough. The United States has essentially twisted the arm of South Korea and is forcing them to build a Navy base on a little island just south of the Korean Peninsula called Jeju Island. Jeju Island is a small fishing and farming village on the south side of Jeju Island called Gagnon Village. It's 450 years old. People have been fishing and farming there, and the women, the old women, 60, 70, even 85 years old, put on wetsuits and dive, hold their breath, and dive to the bottom of the sea to pick up sea life in order to make a living. And just offshore, waving in the water, in the ocean water, are these UNESCO-recognized soft coral reefs, endangered species that will be destroyed as the seabed is dredged in order to make it possible for U.S. warships like aircraft carriers and submarines and these Aegis destroyers, make it possible for them to come into port. The rocky coast, what the people call Gurumbi, sacred rocky coast, where their relatives have been praying for 450 years, is now being blasted by the Samsung Corporation in order to begin the process of building the docks and the piers to port these warships. And a boycott has now been declared of the Samsung Corporation. I hope all of you will honor that boycott. Cement is now being brought in. I read just yesterday that 32 cement trucks had come in that day into the community. People are fighting every day, 12, 14 hours a day, trying to block the gates, trying to get back onto Gurumbi Rock, the sacred rock that has now been completely encased with razor wire. Many of them are going to jail. Priests and nuns have come from all over the country, many times arrested, trying to block this base from being constructed. We were invited by the village to hold our Global Network's annual meeting there last February. And we had people come from 13 countries. And when we went there, they took us out on kayaks, out to Gurumbi Rock, moved us out there one at a time on these kayaks, and where 16 of us crawled under the razor wire in order to try to get onto the rocky coast. We were arrested and taken to jail. And when I returned, I decided that I had to do more to support the people there, who are literally the most determined, dedicated, fiercest nonviolent fighters I've ever seen in all my years as an activist. And so I sent out an email asking people to donate so that we could send 2 members of Veterans for Peace to Jeju Island. And enough money came in to send 6 people. And so we found another person to go, another member of Veterans for Peace. So the 3 of them immediately took off. And when they got off the planes in Korea, they were met by immigration, who had their picture on a piece of paper, took them and put them on a plane and sent them home. A week later, a Japanese delegation that tried to go to Jeju Island was also apprehended and turned away and sent home again. But we were not going to be defeated. And so we found another member of Veterans for Peace from the West Coast. And we found another way to get him into the country. And he's been there now about 3 weeks. And we're now also going to send more people as well. But why is Jeju Island so important to the United States? Why do they want to have a port on this beautiful island that is called Peace Island? Well, Obama recently announced this pivot of U.S. foreign and military policy from the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific region. He also went to Australia, you might have heard, where he negotiated a deal to send 2,500 U.S. Marines to Darwin in northern Australia. I don't know if you'd heard that Australia was in a bit of a situation that they needed the U.S. Marines to come in and liberate them from some unknown enemy, some unknown calamity. As it turns out, China imports 60% of its oil on ships through the Yellow Sea. And if you look at a map of Korea and of Jeju Island, you see that Jeju Island essentially sits at the mouth or the front gate of the Yellow Sea, giving the U.S. the ability to essentially close off the shipping lanes that China uses to import their resources. So while the U.S. knows it cannot compete economically with China anymore, it's made the determination that if we can control China's access to resources, we will hold the keys to their economic engine. This is a provocative, a dangerous, an expensive, and may I even say, insane military strategy that we are now embarking on. Let me tell you about a U.S. Space Command war game set in the year 2016 that the Space Command annually holds around the first of the year, every year. It's called the Red Team versus the Blue Team. And in this war game, the United States launches a first strike attack on China. China today, admittedly, has 20 nuclear weapons, 20 nuclear missiles capable of hitting the west coast of the United States. And in this first strike attack, the U.S. tries to take out those 20 nuclear missiles. The first weapon that is used is the military space plane, the successor to the shuttle, that flies down from orbit, drops a devastating attack, either conventional and or nuclear, and then goes back up into space again. Following that, other weapon systems are used to try to take out China's 20 nuclear missiles. But inevitably, they don't get all of them. So China fires its retaliatory capability at the U.S. It is then that the missile defense systems on these ground-based launchers and on the Aegis warships in the region are used to take out the remaining Chinese retaliatory capability in this Space Command war game, giving the U.S. a successful first strike attack on China. So after the first strike sword is plunged into the heart of either Russia or China, missile defense systems now surrounding both those nations would pick off remaining retaliatory strikes. Absolutely provocative, absolutely insane, and both countries, Russia and China, must respond. And so China is now taking its nuclear missiles, putting them on submarines so they'll be survivable after a U.S. first strike attack. Russia is building new generations of weapon systems and again threatening to pull out of the New START treaty. Just prior to the 2008 election, an old friend of mine in Maine, a man by the name of Herschel Sternlieb, asked me, "Bruce, have you ever heard of the Crown family in Chicago?" I said, no, I never have. He said, "Go home and Google them, Crown, C-R-O-W-N. And so I did. And what I learned was that at the time of the election, the Crown family was the largest stockholder in the General Dynamics Corporation. General Dynamics that owns Bath Iron Works in Maine, where they build these Navy Aegis destroyers. And the Crown family collectively gave Obama $500,000 in the 2008 election campaign. In fact, after Obama won, after the election was over, Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine reported that Obama received more campaign donations from the military-industrial complex than the Republican war hawk John McCain did in 2008. The Crown family is a Jewish family, and they also introduced Obama to the national Jewish community and raised funds for him there as well. And again, since Obama became president, he said we're going to set aside Bush's deployment plan of missile defense, which was largely a Boeing and Lockheed Martin program, and instead we're going with the Aegis program on board these ships built by, guess who, General Dynamics. The cost of the standard Aegis destroyer, what they call the DDG-51, was $1.5 billion. But a new version of these destroyers is under construction today, what they call the DDG-1000. And because it's a new ship, and they expect some number of cost overruns, some level of cost overruns, they don't really know exactly how much it's going to cost. But they say it will be somewhere between $3 and $5 billion per copy. I believe Obama is essentially paying back General Dynamics for helping him become President of the United States of America. During the Bush years, one evening I was home watching my favorite TV show, C-SPAN. It was probably 2005 or 2006. The war in Iraq was going on. And I just happened to run across a program that was just starting, a 3-hour presentation to a huge auditorium of high-level military brass. And they also said in the introduction, many high-level CIA people were there as well. The speaker on that occasion was Thomas Barnett, author of a new book at that time by the name of The Pentagon's New Map. He was then a Naval War College instructor in Rhode Island. He was introduced to the auditorium of these folks as Donald Rumsfeld's strategy guy. And I want to share with you what he said about the coming military strategy of the United States, because I think it obviously applies to our current situation. He said that under corporate globalization of the world economy, every country is going to have a different role. He said, we're not going to make things in America anymore. We're not going to have an industrial policy where we make shoes or clothes or chairs or refrigerators or TVs or VCRs and even cars. Our job, he said, will be security export. In fact, 2 years ago, I heard a rumor that Sears had come out with a new line of kids' clothes. Any of you hear of this? A friend of mine and I went to check it out at our local Sears store. And you know, Sears is pretty much a working class, middle class kind of store. Rich people don't shop there. And we went into the little boys section and we found a line of military uniforms. So what's the message to the kids today in America? This is all you're going to be, security export. And so is it any coincidence that today the #1 industrial export product of America is what? Weapons. Weapons. And when weapons are your #1 industrial export product, what is your global marketing strategy for that product line? That's right. Barnett, in his presentation, used a huge PowerPoint screen, and on there he put a map of the world. And what he said was that there is a part of the world that is not today submitting to the authority of corporate globalization. He called it the non-integrating gap. The non-integrating gap. And he said, our job under security export, then, will be to go into these parts of the world and build compliance, if you will, and we will never come home. And then he went on to name the non-integrating gap. The Middle East, where we were at that time totally mired in the war in Iraq, still today involved heavily there. Central Asia, where we were then and are today with our war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Africa, where Barnett said we'll be fighting 20 years from now for their oil. Well, as it turned out, he's kind of a prophet. Because just not too long ago, we all know that the U.S. and NATO invaded Libya, who holds the largest supplies of oil on the African continent. And then finally he said parts of Latin America are in this non-integrating gap. Places like Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez is not answering the telephone of the oil majors. And so these are the parts of the world, he said, that we will be in a state of endless conflict with. Africa is now, the U.S. has now created this Africa Command, AFRICOM they call it. And the job of AFRICOM is to set up basing relationships with every country on the African continent. So that lily pad bases, small interventionary, quick reaction bases can be set up in each African country so that we can immediately move to any place that is again resisting this corporate domination. I saw a video very recently of an African farmer way out in the bush coming one day to work in his field, and this white American shows up and tells him to leave. And the African says, "What are you talking about? This is my land. I've been farming here for our family for generations." And the white man said, "I own it now. Get out of here." And these big American corporations are now buying up farmland all over the African continent, moving the people off their land. And so they're going to need AFRICOM to go in and be enforcers of this new capitalist relationship. Well, one of the things Barnett said in that presentation that evening, I said to myself, people are never going to believe this. I'm going to have to order this video because I got to make sure I get this quote right. And the quote was this: Adolf Hitler never had to ask permission to invade another country, and neither will we. And Barnett also told the audience on that occasion that we're not going to do international treaties anymore because they would restrict our ability to maneuver around the world. But friends, there is a problem. There is a problem. It's called the big green, money. There's always an Achilles heel. Every person has one. Every politician has one. And every plan for corporate domination of the world has an Achilles heel. But in an editorial in one of the industry publications called Space News a few years ago, they said, "Don't worry about it, friends. Look, we know we as an industry have to come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all this stuff that we're doing." And we have. And we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that funding source. The Pentagon has been saying for some time that space technology, what we generically call Star Wars, will be the largest industrial project on the history of the planet Earth. Today, with military satellites orbiting the Earth, the Space Command has had to build what are called downlink stations all over the planet. In Greenland, Australia, England, Norway, many, many, many other countries around the planet. And people in those countries are saying, we don't want to be part of the Star Wars program. And these are the organizations that have made up the membership of the global network for all these years. And as these military satellites orbit the Earth, they talk to these ground stations, sending signals in what they call real time, split-second time. Back here in the United States, you know about Creech Air Force Base outside of Las Vegas, where the drone pilots sit in front of computers essentially with joysticks in their hands, looking at the screens, hooked up through these satellites, flying these drones that are going over Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they're sitting there. Is it Al-Qaeda? Is it the Taliban? Is it a wedding? Is it a funeral? And they could hit the button, and in real time, split-second time, the missiles are fired from the drones, hitting and killing, oftentimes, most of the time, innocent civilians. Today, whether you're a troop on the ground, driving a Humvee around Afghanistan, busting down doors in the middle of the night, your Humvee is hooked up to that satellite, giving you a map of a very specific map of every house in the area where you are. If you're on a tank, if you're on a plane, no matter where you are, you're hooked up to satellites in space. So they say that all warfare today on the earth is net-centric. Net-centric. When the U.S. launched the shock and awe invasion of Iraq in 2003, in the initial attack, 70% of the weapons that were used were directed to their targets by space satellites. And so the Pentagon is saying that if we can do this, so can somebody else, right? So we can't allow any other country to have access to space. We've got to be the master of space. We've got to control and dominate space. And so at the same time, the Space Command is working on anti-satellite weapons that would give us the ability to take out another country's satellite in times of hostility. All very crazy. So again, getting back to space news, they said, we've got to come up with a funding source to pay for this, and we've identified one, and we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that funding source. And they said, it's the entitlement programs, which officially in America are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program after Bill Clinton got finished with it. These are the programs that they've identified for defunding. So it's no coincidence that in the last couple of years, we're hearing all this talk coming out of the political class that the entitlement programs are not sustainable. Even the Democrats are saying we're going to have to increase retirement age for Social Security. We're going to have to make some tough cuts, they say, in Medicare and Medicaid. And so these are, again, the programs that both parties, both war parties, have identified to defund over time in order to pay for all of this. So it's no coincidence then that increasingly our local communities have become addicted to military spending. I want to give two illustrations of this point. Colorado Springs, where the Air Force Space Command is headquartered, Fort Carson Army Base is expanding rapidly because they need more area to train their high-tech weapons that they're now using. They're now encroaching on rancher lands, and ranchers in Colorado are now organizing to oppose the Army. Normally conservative, patriotic ranchers organizing to oppose the expansion of Fort Carson. But in Colorado Springs, 50% of the local economy is now connected to military spending. A whole slew of weapons contractors there, serving the Space Command, Fort Carson, and all the rest. In Huntsville, Alabama, the Army Space Command is headquartered there. Redstone Arsenal is there. And again, a whole slew of weapons contractors are there. They call themselves the Pentagon of the South. And 75% of the local economy is connected to the military-industrial complex. Well, how will we ever end America's addiction to war and violence as long as our local communities rely on Pentagon largesse in order to create jobs so people can feed their families? Take a guess. Where do you think California rates in the 50 states in terms of money from the Pentagon? Anyone know?
One. First.
Used to be.
Number 2. Virginia is number 1. Your state is number 2. I was surprised to learn that Massachusetts, the liberal Massachusetts, is number 5. Raytheon is headquartered there. Might have something to do with it.
It's 3 and 4.
Sorry?
It's 3 and 4.
3 and 4. I can tell you very quickly. Texas and Connecticut.
R.
3 and 4.
General that gigantic yellow boat.
The peace movement, is always having to say no, right? No war, no blood for oil, no war in Iran, no attack in Iran. But what is our yes? Do we have a yes today?
Yeah.
Kill the American dream, yes.
That's pretty good. That's a unifying vision. I was looking for kind of a unifying vision. Do we have one?
Succession to union.
Nationalized energy company.
Oops, say it again.
Succession to union.
Oh, that's a good one, yeah. Vermont likes that. Vermont's talking about that.
Succession to union.
Succession from the Union, yes. Well, I would propose this. Let's try this on for size. I would propose that we need something that would connect with the labor movement, the environmental movement, the social justice movement, and the peace movement. And what I've come up with, especially because I live in Maine, which is absolutely being devastated today economically. We have a teabag governor, a Republican teabag governor, who says climate change doesn't exist. He's destroying public education, closing schools like crazy, destroying the unions, cutting back on social programs like a wild man. And unemployment is growing rapidly in our state. The biggest employer in our state, the military and industrial complex, General Dynamics. So jobs is a huge issue in Maine. And anytime you talk about jobs in Maine, you really get people's attention. And so, of course, all the politicians are talking about jobs. But how are the politicians going to create jobs when the corporations are moving millions and millions of jobs overseas so they can maximize profits internationally with cheap foreign labor? So with that happening, who's going to invest back here at home in creating real jobs that do good things in a big way, that meet our needs? We have more than 27 states now in fiscal crisis. Who's going to do that? Where's that money going to come from? Remember, especially that Barnett told us that our role under corporate globalization is going to be security export. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're hollowing out America at this time. All right, if you want to have a whole generation to go and fight and die so the corporations can control declining supplies of resources around the world, oil, natural gas, minerals in Africa, water, you need a constant economic draft, right? And there's nothing more dangerous in this country or any other country than educated, unemployed people. So if you hollow out education, you reduce people's self-confidence, you reduce their expectations, and you give them few other options than to join the military. And so this is what's happening today. So how are we really going to create jobs in America? Well, thank goodness for the University of Massachusetts at Amherst Economics Department, who have done the definitive study on this very question. It's called The U.S. Employment Effects of Military and Domestic Spending Priorities, December 2011. And what they did at UMass was they looked at $1 billion of spending on military production, and they said, yes, it's true. If you spend $1 billion on military production, you create 8,600 jobs. Absolutely true. But they said, if you take that same $1 billion and you invest it in giving tax cuts to the people, you create 10,800 jobs. Or if you put it into clean energy, like home weatherization. Where I live in Maine, we have the oldest housing stock in the country. Our house that I live in an intentional community, was built in the late 1700s. A very old house. Last year we had an energy audit, and they discovered We had so many little leaks and holes in our house that it created the equivalent of a 4-foot hole that we were using to heat our entire neighborhood very generously. And so we had our house weatherized, but it was not cheap to do it. And there are a lot of poor people, unemployed people in Maine that can't afford to pay for heating oil now as it's going up, and their house is leaking. Wouldn't it be great if the government, instead of spending all our money on war, would renovate their homes? And if we did that, per $1 billion, we'd create 12,000 jobs. Or if we put that $1 billion into health care, we'd create 12,300 jobs. Or if we put it into education, we'd create 19,100 jobs. Or, my favorite, if we built a national rail system, connecting every corner of America, getting us out of our gas-guzzling cars, so that we don't have to go to war for oil, so that we, maybe even in a small way, begin to help solve for climate change. We would create 19,675 jobs per $1 billion. Imagine that. I want to read to you something. This book is Military Industrial Complex at 50, a series of speeches by various people that, from a conference in Virginia last November. David Swanson edited this book. And my partner, Mary Beth Sullivan, who's done a lot of work on economic conversion. She has an article in here, and I want to read just a bit about one paragraph from her piece. She's talking about Seymour Melman, the father of economic conversion. He died a few years ago. He was an economics professor at Columbia University. This is what Mary Beth writes. In one of Melman's last articles, at the dawn of the 21st century, his frustration was palpable. He noted that New York City put out a request for a proposal to spend about $3 to $4 billion to replace a number of subway cars. Not a single U.S. company bid on the proposal, in part because the U.S. no longer has the tools it needed to build its own subway trains. In the article titled, "In the Grip of a Permanent War Economy," Melman calculated that if this manufacturing work were done in the United States, it would have generated, directly or indirectly, about 32,000 jobs. Now let me ask, I've been taking a poll as I'm traveling so far in California. I've been asking people this question. I'd like to see a show of hands. Those of you that would rather see $1 billion of your tax dollars go into military production, creating 8,600 jobs, please raise your hand. Those of you that would rather see $1 billion of your tax dollars go into building a national rail system, creating 19,675 jobs per billion, please raise your hand. Wow. Continues, the trend continues. Very encouraging, very encouraging. Well, you know, there was once another time in American history where we had a very dark and evil, very despicable economic system that people said would never, never end. And in fact, the politicians, by and large, all supported it. The media, by and large, supported it. The religious leaders across the country, by and large, with some notable exceptions, supported it. It was called slavery. But there were very determined people called the abolitionists during those days, and they fought on. One of them, a guy by the name of Frederick Douglass, said this: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And so, friends, I ask you, today, here we are, chained, if you will, to this military, industrial, corporate, criminal syndicate. It feels so pervasive in our lives. Our local communities are increasingly addicted to military spending. As state budgets dry up around the country, universities and colleges are turning to the Pentagon for funding, for the computer engineering departments, computer science departments, astronomy departments, mathematics departments. More and more we're seeing the military-industrial complex work their way into the public universities. In Albuquerque, the University of New Mexico now has a top secret area on campus, on a state campus, where they're doing military research, high-tech research for Star Wars and other space weapons, exotic technologies. How do we get out from behind this 8-ball? What is our demand? We do have a serious problem today, and it's not Iran, it's not Russia, it's not China, it is indeed climate change. And what are we doing about it? The Pentagon is the world's biggest polluter today in the world, contributing mightily to the coming ravages of climate change. What are we doing about it? Could it be that if we were to create a unified demand with our friends in the labor movement, who would obviously benefit from this program in terms of jobs created, from the environmental community, who would obviously benefit from a national rail system, a solar society, other sustainable technologies that would be built. Social justice organizations would benefit as well from this new direction. Wouldn't we all build, if we created a unified demand that we placed onto the political system? But for a long time now, it's my opinion that the progressive community has followed the business model of organizing. I recognize that it was so deep in our culture when my son was very young. And I went to pick him up one day at his daycare center. He and the other kids were stuffing their toys under their legs to hide them from each other. They were learning already at the very youngest age how it works in America. Every person for themselves. Dog eat dog. Guard your resources closely. Organizations have a very singular focus. Don't connect the dots. Don't dare connect to other issues outside of your own, because that might somehow help the other person and weaken you. And most of all, guard your volunteers and your donors and even your media contacts. The business model of organizing. Well, I think this is why we're all losing today. Because we're all isolated from each other. We're easily picked off and put against each other. Today in Augusta, Maine, they're pitting one group against the other as they're slashing social spending. One group saying, throw us a few crumbs, don't give it to them. And people are forced to go at each other's throat. This is an evil, despicable way of managing a country and a government. We need a new model, an absolute new model. And I think each of us has to take responsibility to make that model happen. Thank God, though, for the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement, which has begun to create more linkages between issues. That has begun to say that the corporate domination of our political system, the corporate drowning of our political system, is the reality that we all face, no matter which issue we work on. Because all of our issues are connected to this corporate domination. But the Occupy movement still, though, does not yet sufficiently enough connect to this massive $1 trillion a year military machine that is growing like a cancer around the world. And I think, again, each of us has to help in our own local communities to bring these connections closer and closer together. I see it as a puzzle on the wall. As the pieces become clearer, we all understand. So if each of our movements, I'm not saying people should drop the important issue they're working on, but find ways to connect the dots. Find ways to help the public see the larger picture so that we accelerate the consciousness development of the American people and the confidence of the American people in a bigger way. Our Mother Earth is taking a pounding today by the war machine of the United States military and NATO. She's thrashing wildly as her body is in toxic shock. And I ask you to go home with this question and think about it. What is the number one job of a human being on this earth today? What does it mean to be a human on this planet in this moment? And what is the most important thing we can do with our lives? The future generations are calling on all of us to make a trip to the Wizard of Oz, to get more courage, to get more determination, so that we can tell more truth and stand up stronger to fight for the next 7 generations. Thank you all very much for listening.